Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Preserving History and Democracy. My name is Cynthia Mendoza, Communications Coordinator for the Doñana County Clerk's Office, and today I am joined by our very special producer, Bernadine Caparel. How are you, Bern?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. You found just another guest that has some amazing knowledge about an incredible topic. Can you tell us who our guest is today?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. We have with us today Mr. Sean Schifano, and he'll be talking about the Sephardic Jews that came into our region. This is of special interest to me personally because my son, who got married about 2 years ago now, he married a Jewish girl with Sephardic roots. So I'm really interested in this.
Oh, great. That's wonderful to hear. And I have to say, since I began work on this topic, I've had an unusually high number of encounters with people of Sephardic descent, not just within the scope of the project, but people who are at the margins of periphery in one way or another, people I run into like yourself, who alert me to an ancestor or family connection who has Sephardic descent and isn't connected to my project in any way or connected to New Mexico in any way.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So before I began living as a hermit, I was in a past life a budding historian of science, and that's really where I got my graduate level start in history. I was a history major as an undergrad, minored in philosophy and religion, and had an interest in Judaic history and Jewish studies then, but didn't do very much with it professionally. My graduate work was primarily in history of ecology at first, as well as some history of chemistry, pre-modern chemistry. And in summer of 2012, I interned with the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History and discovered that I was actually much more interested in museums, public history, archives, spaces where professional academic history meets the non-specialist public. And in summer of 22, I came to New Mexico intending to do a borderlands project of some kind, probably in environmental history, history of ecology. And soon after coming here, I started hearing accounts and reading materials about Converso descendants, Judeo-Converso descendants in the southwest and northern Mexico. And this eventually attracted me enough that I abandoned any prospect of a project in history of science or environmental history and switched instead to attempting to archive modern records of this community. And so that has brought me to the archive I'm building now, which I'm sure we'll have some time to get into a little later.
Yes, we have to talk about that. We absolutely have to. I've heard that Sephardic Jewish people are in our past here. Can you unpack what is that and what does that mean?
The term Sfarad is a Hebrew word that today almost always refers to the entire Iberian Peninsula. So typically when we're talking about Sephardic Jews, we are talking about Jews of descent from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. There is now another sense of the word Sephardic that has nothing to do with this connection, and that is because there is a rite, R-I-T-E, rite, of Jewish practice that originated in what is now the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, and that rite is understood, at least in its label, as Sephardic. But that Sephardic label has only a mixed connection to Spain and Portugal in any way. For our purposes, when we're talking about Sephardic Jews, we're talking about what are typically now called Western Sephardim. So Sephardic Jews who originated in Spain and Portugal and did not immigrate to what became the Ottoman Empire later on.
Okay.
And then with that founding population, you eventually end up with an offshoot in the aftermath of 1391 and 1492, which I'm sure we'll have time to discuss, of Judeo-Conversos, or just Conversos. And Conversos are persons who voluntarily or forcibly, with some slight scare quotes around the word voluntarily,
Right.
Were made to convert to Catholicism or opted to do so freely. And in a few cases, we do know that happened. So the Judeo-Converso community is in some ways Jewish, at least by descent, and in some ways Catholic. And that liminality and in-betweenness comes to color not only the way that Judeo-Conversos think of themselves, but the way that they think of membership in a group of people. And the last term I'd like to introduce and give some context for is very popular today and probably the most difficult and problematic to parse, which is a crypto-Jew or crypto-Jews. That term tends to be the catch-all for persons who now claim Converso descent, and I am wary of using it too loosely myself, simply because it builds into itself the label of Jew in an essentialist way that for me as a historian I find somewhat problematic.
Okay.
Because it's not at all clear that a person of Converso descent, even if they could trace their genealogy with flawless accuracy, would thereby have claim to some kind of essential, immovable Jewishness that simply persists in an unproblematic way through time. So it becomes much murkier and more complex to parse someone who identifies today as a crypto-Jew or as descendant of a crypto-Jew, because the term already connotes, just in the use of the word, the idea that they were fundamentally Jewish, and that tells us something about how many people who use the word today conceive of their identity. So that trifecta of terms, Sephardim or Sephardic Jews, Conversos, Judeo-Conversos, and crypto-Jews are really the trifecta of terms that we would be using to talk about this population now.
Okay.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because as I was reading about it and doing the research, it is very confusing. It certainly can be confusing as to what term is appropriate for me to use. Even in writing the script for us today, I struggled with which term I should really use on paper.
And even for the construction of my archive, I should footnote by saying that its original name was the Crypto-Jewish Historical Archives. But within a couple of months, I had already begun to meet people willing to donate their materials to the archive who identified as descendants of some kind of Converso, but who did not believe that their family had inherited any practiced traditions or customs or beliefs. So they would have been Converso descendants or Converso claimants to Converso descent, I should say, but who did not identify as crypto-Jews or as descendants of crypto-Jews.
Okay.
And so late in the game, before I pitched this project to New Mexico's Commission of Public Records in November, I modified its name to the Converso Legacy Archives to emphasize that we are talking about the historical legacy of a pre-modern founding population from which modern claimants to Converso crypto-Jewish descent get their sense of structure and identity.
So what was happening regarding religion in Spain during the Age of Exploration?
Well, okay, that's a massive question because it's a massive empire.
Right.
The Spanish Empire is one of the largest that the world has ever seen, and religiosity finds a number of complex and nuanced expressions during that period. For our purposes, I think I would want to flag, most importantly, the escalation in anti-Jewish sentiment leading up to the Age of Exploration, because it is that pivotal phase, that inflection period, in about the late 14th century leading up to the end of the 15th century, that the relationship between Catholic monarchs in the Iberian Peninsula and the Jewish population there really begins to change. So in 1391, there is a coming to a head of some previous tensions that had existed within Catholic Spain, and the Jewish population was forced to undergo a mass conversion. And this begins a long period of slow decline over the next century in perceptions about Jews, their proper relationship to Christianity, and about the need for Catholic monarchs, the duty of Catholic monarchs, to do all that they can to convert Jews living in their kingdoms. By 1492, this begins to take a new form, namely the problem created by forced converts and some voluntary converts. There are members of the population who do convert voluntarily, although I should always flag pressure as a factor in their conversions. And the growth of this mass converted population drives a wedge in between the Catholic monarchs and the Catholic powers that be and their enablers, whether we're talking about monastic orders or priests or the Catholic laity, and those Jews who remained Jews and did not undergo mass conversion. The answer that Ferdinand and Isabella came up with in 1492 was that in order to ensure that the converted would not revert to Jewish practice, the Jews and Jewish adjacent in now more or less united Spain will be given an ultimatum, and the ultimatum is convert or get out. Many more do undergo mass conversion at this stage, and a large number of Jews who don't want to convert migrate over next door to Portugal. But through some intermarriage of monarchical families, ruling families, King Manuel I of Portugal then follows suit in late 1496 of doing there what had been done in Spain and forcing large numbers of Jews there to convert. Of those who did not, many fled to specific outposts that are now fairly famous as Sephardic enclaves in the Age of Exploration. So Amsterdam is probably the best known one, but Livorno in what is now Italy, Hamburg in what's now Germany, these outposts. And then a large population, some estimate as much as half, who did not convert and did not settle in one of these smaller outposts, opted instead to migrate all the way to the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan was very happy to have them because they had achieved a status primarily within Spain as merchants, as physicians, as officials. And so they were persons who were capable of being co-opted into an empire. And the Ottoman Empire then is more than happy to receive them. The Sultan specifically says, the crown's loss is my gain. And with the discovery the same year, 1492, of the Americas, although it's not known for about another 125 years that this is in fact what Columbus had found. Even Columbus went to his grave thinking that he had discovered part of Asia and didn't really understand that it was a separate landmass. But in the same year, 1492, there of course begins mass migration to the Americas.
Right.
And this becomes an arm of the Spanish Empire. With regard to religion in this age of exploration, we can't overstate the centrality of the role of mendicant monastic orders. So these are monastic orders who do not live a cloistered life in a cloistered environment. They are not contemplative orders like the Benedictines, but they are instead orders whose job is to preach and teach. And the Catholic Church and its leadership, this time Pope Alexander VI, realizes that there is an unprecedented prospect for the conversion and establishment of Catholic religion in this new world. And so he and his successors, beginning with Julius II and so on, opt to bankroll the establishment of Catholic churches in the New World, as well as bankroll ships to go there and settle the land, because insofar as they were settled by Spaniards and the Spanish crown, they would be Catholic regions.
Right.
But of course, as soon as this happens, the mendicant friars are confronted with a bewildering number of tribal groups, religions, customs, languages, and all of this has to be brokered in some meaningful way in order to convert the native tribes to Christianity, and specifically to Catholicism. So within the Age of Exploration, we see at one and the same time the beginnings of massive numbers of conversions to Catholicism in the New World, and the beginnings of Jewish migration there and Converso migration there. Officially, at least by the 16th century, Conversos and Jews who were conflated by most Catholic authorities were formally banned from coming to the New World at all.
Is that right?
But it was too late because
were here.
They had already started migrating and continued migrating. The one thing I'll wrap up with on that score is to say that for about a 60-year period during the Age of Exploration, beginning in the late 16th century and rolling on into the early 17th century, the crowns of Spain and Portugal are actually united. And because there are so many Conversos in Portugal and of Portuguese descent, you see two very interesting things. One is that the term Portuguese becomes often conflated with Jew. And so one indicator in many Inquisition dossiers that we stumble onto is the continued reference of the Portuguese, which are almost always coded as Jews because there were larger numbers of Conversos,
Wow.
Conversos there. And so in this short period of about 60 years during which the crowns are united, more and more and more Conversos and some Jews begin migrating to the New World and carrying out mercantile activity there. Most of them are Portuguese merchant families in large kinship networks. So they cover for one another, they interact with one another, they trade and help establish trade together. The inevitable result of this is that more and more signs of Judaizing, which is the official term, become evident in the New World. And the response by the Spanish and Portuguese crowns is to bring the Inquisition with them. The Inquisition had already been founded in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, but it isn't tasked with converting people. It is tasked with bringing people who had already been converted back if they were slipping in some way or reverting to practices that were not accepted. And so by the Age of Exploration, just to finish up, we now have this extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily far-reaching Spanish empire in which the Portuguese play a pivotal role. And at the same time, you have the emergence of the Inquisition, not just as a force in Europe, but from 1571 forward, also in the New World. And it is established in Mexico City with the express purpose of finding and weeding out the Judaizers and various other heretics who might have popped up there through migration.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
And what would they do if they did pop up?
There would be an interrogation process in which the person would be confronted with alleged evidence and accusations of their Judaizing in this case. And if they were found guilty, the core purpose was not simply to isolate and successfully prosecute the individual who had been accused, but usually to also make sure that you find out who they are connected to.
Oh boy.
Because Jewish identity is a communal identity, and inquisitors are not so thick that they can't understand that if you are practicing it, your family members may well be doing the same.
Right.
And so it's not that uncommon to find deponents in inquisitorial dossiers who will inform on other members of their community and sometimes their own families. This brings us, though, to a problem that the Inquisition has in general, and really any attempt at criminal proceedings anywhere has, which is that if something is considered a crime, if an act or collection of acts is considered a crime, and accusation of that crime is politically useful, if it's politically expedient for the accuser, then you will, I will say inevitably, get larger numbers of accusers using that as the tool by which they get rid of or marginalize or subjugate persons that they don't like.
Okay.
Sometimes that dislike is in fact because of the reason they say. But at other times, it's clearly much more political
Yes.
and designed to remove someone from a community, from a leadership position, administrative position, that you would very much like to get rid of, perhaps because you would like to take that person's spot.
Right.
So just like witchcraft, through the early modern period, it becomes an incredibly attractive tool to accuse someone of Judaizing, or of having family who were Judaizers, as a way to delegitimize them personally and remove them from credibility. But I don't want to sell the Inquisition too short, because they are, at least some of the time, attempting to get to the bottom of what is true through what evidence they can find. So, for example, in Mexico, John Chuchiak, I hope I'm getting that name right, in his excellent documentary history of the Mexican Inquisition, says that between 1571, when the Inquisition is founded in Mexico, and 1700, 324 persons were accused of Judaizing, of whom a much smaller number, 29, were actually executed. You sort of, there's a tendency to think in terms of tens of thousands or of vast numbers, and certainly in Europe we see many thousands of accused Judaizers killed. And I would say that execution isn't the only option. You can be publicly flogged. You can be punished in effigy if, for whatever reason, you are not in a condition to be punished corporally, either because of your physical frailty or because you died in between the time of your accusation and the time of when you would be punished, which could happen quite easily. So the truck-sized caveat to the smaller number of executions is that the prison conditions were deplorable, and not being killed was really the least of your problems, because you could receive other forms of punishment from Inquisition in whatever region it happened to be established in at the time. So I don't want to make too much of the relatively small number of persons executed, because there was certainly a much wider field of concentric circles of various punishments and a general attitude of community dislike. So if you were suspected of being a converso or of having family who were conversos, even if you were never brought to trial or formally accused, your reputation could very well suffer indefinitely, and your children's reputation could suffer indefinitely, simply because of having that question called up, of having your old Christian status, your Cristiano Viejo status, called into question.
Right. Harsh times.
Harsh times.
So how did Sephardic Jews end up in this area?
So once we begin talking about this area, insofar as we're talking about New Mexico, when we're talking about something as specific as New Mexico, I have to put a bold-faced disclaimer under everything I say, because the paper trail starts to fade tremendously as compared to, say, inquisitorial dossiers in Mexico. The population was quite small. The records of Judaizing are far fewer, and we don't have great evidence of material culture, which is to some extent what you would expect, whether we're talking about crypto Jews, whatever exactly that term would mean by this time, or we're talking about conversos. But if you look at a topographic map of Mexico, you will notice that it forms three basic corridors, and they're offset by the Sierra Madre Mountains. And the central corridor leads up to what is today Texas. The southern, not quite the southernmost point, but one of the southern points of that central corridor is Mexico City. And so there is a direct thoroughfare from Mexico City straight up without having to cross a mountain range to what is now Texas and the edge of New Mexico. Settling Mexico City, which is then and is now the hub of Mexico. It is the point of departure for immigrants coming. It is the place to which mercantile families of Portuguese conversos arrived. And so that from that hub, we start to see a radiating out into smaller and smaller hinterlands Zacatecas is a famous one that seems to have harbored a fair number of conversos, primarily as miners of silver. But more famously, we also see the founding of the state of Nuevo León in the north, where Monterrey is. And it does appear that a significant number of its founders were of Converso stock, and in some cases were actually crypto Jews. The most famous case is Luis de Carvajal, El Mozo, the younger, who was famously killed for publicly professing the Jewish religion and his membership in it. Ultimately, not only him, but several members of his family were also executed as being part of a family network of Judaizers. So, but in some ways, he is the exception that proves the rule, because this public proclamation and willingness to die for it is actually quite unusual in Mexico. By the mid 17th century, there are enough people in what is today New Mexico that we will start to see occasional references to accusations of Judaizing. The most famous one is in the 1660s of a man named Francisco Gómez Robledo. And the accusation is that not only he, but his father were Portuguese conversos. I mentioned earlier that there was a 60-year period of unity between Portugal and Spain. Well, when that breaks down, so too do Spanish-derived, Spanish-descended sentiments about the Portuguese. There are economic reasons for this, because as I mentioned, the family networks tend to be of Portuguese stock, but they also tend to be merchants. And so the economic incentive for accusing and punishing these people acts independent of their actual converso or putatively crypto-Jewish status.
Right.
And there's a nationalist element, because the separation of the kingdoms once more happens on the back of a ferocious independence movement, from which there is then a backlash. So if you're living in a place like Mexico, which is settled in part by Portuguese, and you know who the Portuguese members of the community are, suddenly it becomes a matter of both national identity and, let's say, ethno-religious identity, to begin accusing persons who were in some cases conversos, and in some cases almost certainly not, of Judaizing,
right.
And as best as you can to get them punished, preferably by deporting them. And so I mentioned execution is not the only factor here.
Yeah.
Being deported is certainly one of them, because typically in a deportation, you not only are sent out, but you lose all of your property and have it confiscated by the local government.
How convenient.
How convenient. And so for migrations into New Mexico, the trail starts to run much colder. And for someone like Francisco Gómez Robledo, the accusations are about all we have. In fact, by the end of his trial, he is let go.
Oh,
he is set free.
Okay.
And never punished. But the small number of founder families in what is now New Mexico means that several moderns are in fact direct or indirect descendants of the Gomez family and of Gomez Robledo himself, including Rob Martinez, who is currently the state historian of New Mexico.
Oh, wow.
So if you look up the summer 2025, the latest edition of Legacy, which is the newsletter for the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, you will see a story by him about the Inquisition,
Wow.
which mentions Gomez Robledo and actually mentions that several families are descended from him, including the author, he says.
Wow. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So how was this practice of Judaism hidden at that time?
There is a sense of a cohesive construct that we would retrospectively think of as Judaism.
Right.
I want to be careful about that ism, though, because it is also connected to a sense of ethnic identity. And so where today we have a very consolidated, creedal concept of what a religion is. It's a very Protestant concept of what a religion is. A religion is a body of propositions which, if accepted, means that you are a member of that religion, and if you do not accept them, you are not a member of that religion. There is clearly a grain of truth to that way of constructing it, but for Judaism in particular, this is problematic.
Right.
Because Judaism historically and now is an ethno-religion.
Right.
And so it is possible, it is thinkable, to have someone who is perhaps on the margins in terms of their private belief, who doesn't fit a mainstream notion of what real or core Judaism is,
Right.
but who nonetheless are considered and reckoned as others, including rabbinic authorities, as Jews. So in terms of practice, this muddies the waters quite a bit because, as we've seen with the expulsion and mass conversions, you get large numbers of people who, within a generation or two, have lost continuity with the Kehillah, the Jewish community, and they have entered a phase of intergenerational attrition where their parents, for example, might know Hebrew and they know none at all because they
Right.
simply never had the opportunity to learn it. And so their frame of reference for what Judaism is begins to change. And because of the population's dispersal, and then it's coming back together through the age of exploration, through these mercantile networks and kinship networks, what you tend to find is a pastiche of beliefs that prior to the expulsion would have seemed quite weird, but within the early modern world has to be reckoned with, because these kinship networks don't fall in a very simplistic, clean definition of what a Jew is. And so the entity, the social unit for thinking about these kinship networks is really just that. It's kinship. It is above all who you know and where the people you know came from. So if you're part of a population who all came from the Iberian Peninsula and you all knew that 2 generations back, your ancestors moved to wherever you are now, say from Portugal,
Right.
then what you know is that you share a language, you share a genealogy, and, this is important, religiously, you share an outcast status, even if you converted, because there is another mechanism at work in shaping what Judaism and what a Jew is in this time, and that is the concept of limpieza de sangre. I should say the policy of limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood laws, which are established for the express purpose of distinguishing between those individuals who had Christian stock without undergoing conversion,
Right.
and those who did undergo conversion. So this would include not only Jews, but also Muslims, because we have to remember
Yes.
that the end of the Reconquista also involves the conquest of Granada. And the fall of Granada means that you have an enormous influx into your kingdom's boundaries of Muslims who also have to be dealt with.
Right.
So the social unit for marking out who knows whom and who is, in some sense, either a Jew or a Jewish adjacent person, a one-of-us person, comes to be a unit called the Nação, or the Nación, the nation. Part of the meaning of this kind of protean term, Nação, is similar to what we think of when we say something like a nation state. It is a member of an ethnically cohesive body in some way. But because of the limpieza de sangre concept, because of the expulsions, because of ongoing persecution and anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe, you get pressure from outside to maintain cohesion together as best you can, and you get a sense of that cohesion from within by dint of shared language, by dint of a shared sense of the past, and by these mercantile networks, these occupational social units. And the Nação encompasses all of these in some ways. Sometimes it refers to you as a member of this quasi-racialized occupational unit. Sometimes it refers to you as someone who speaks our language and is generally recognizable as one of us, as a cousin of someone we know who's part of the community, the bona fides of having community membership. But the element of religion in it is rather murky. Sometimes we see these conversos revert to Judaism. And this is quite difficult because it means learning a language that you don't know. It means if you're a man becoming circumcised because you almost certainly weren't when you were born. It means learning an entire collection of customs in a ritual cycle, and this is very difficult. And from what we can gather from records we have obtained from not just Inquisition dossiers, but letters from other administrative records, it seems that Jewish law was followed in a somewhat lax manner, but nonetheless with a sincere conviction by many conversos that they wanted to return to the normative Judaism of their ancestors. And yet, not all of them did, even though they continued remaining within these kinship networks. These networks remained in correspondence with their family members in Iberia. It's not a clean or absolute separation.
Right.
Some members of the community, for example, in the borderlands between France and Spain, not only keep in touch with their family members in Iberia, but spend several months or years in Spain and Portugal as merchants themselves. And while they're there are no synagogues, and
Right.
there's no Jewish frame of reference to live by.
Right.
So you're going to Mass or generally keeping up with Catholic practice, and then maybe around the high holidays or around the time that you were done with whatever mercantile activity you had going on, you would return.
Right.
And you were sort of welcomed in, despite the fact that you basically are taking on and putting off the mantle of Jewishness
Right.
At your will. So this unit of the Nassau, the Nation, the nation, encompasses all of these varied categories, so much so that it's not uncommon to find people who are not, creedally speaking, Jews at all.
Right.
People who did convert, or even who converted and then later reverted to Christianity, who nonetheless are part of this community. We see, for example, in Amsterdam, persons who seem to be fairly well-acculturated Catholics, who nonetheless are part of and recognized as part of the Nassau by rabbinic leaders. And this is a quite unusual and unprecedented development, because it means that at least in some of these Sephardic diaspora communities, it's possible to have Christians who are part of the Nassau and Jews, let's say Ashkenazi Jews who are not part of the Nassau, who are not recognized. Maybe the Ashkenazi Jews have to sit in the back of the synagogue, and the Christian, who is nonetheless
Wow.
part of the Nassau by dint of your occupational connections, by dint of your genealogical connection, gets to sit a little closer to the front.
It's amazing.
It's not something that had really occurred before. It's certainly not in Europe, and the rules from community to community vary significantly. So although you usually will see a recognition of community members as members of the Nassau, what to do with those people and under what category changes significantly from community to community. And that variation means that you don't have any one clean picture of how Jews maintained their practice, but also, importantly, how Conversos reckoned with normative rabbinic leadership and Jewish continuity, which they had lost.
Right. So bring us up to date with DNA testing, what people
Wow.
found out about their heritage. How did that come about?
Before about the 1970s, the only real presence in North America of persons who claimed Converso descent was a small community in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico, generally known as the Venta Prieta community because of the small village where they live. It's about 55 miles-ish outside of Mexico City, and that community had been present, we know, in the 19-teens, 1920s. So there already is, and probably much earlier, if memory serves, I forget his first name, Bonifacio Noyar, in 1880, makes a tour of Mexico in which he specifically seeks out persons of mestizo, and I put that in scare quotes, descent, of mixed indigenous and Iberian descent, who claimed that they were in fact members of the Jewish or Converso community. And over the 1880s, he gathered up a small community of these individuals and formed this Venta Prieta community, who in modern time, in the 20th century, continue to profess that this is where they ultimately came from, that they were ultimately mestizo members of a community who had an admixture of Converso descent. But apart from them, you see very few people, certainly in Mexico, and none that I know of in New Mexico, who claim Converso descent. The one example I can think of besides the Venta Prieta that jumps to mind is a rather famous case of a man named Francisco Rivas Puigcerver, who was a professor of ancient and modern languages at the Escuela Nacional in Mexico City. And he was present in Mexico during the upswing of immigration through the late 19th and then in the boom of the early 20th century during the Porfiriato, the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. And he has some very interesting things to say about his descent, because in fact he claims that his ancestors were Spanish exiles who were Sephardic. Which that's a slightly different shade from a converso, and I don't know of him ever specifically singling out conversos as the population he's descended from. But he does claim that he was a descendant of Spanish exiles who were themselves Jewish. He also claimed that his Cuban-born wife was of Sephardic Jewish stock, and late in the 19th century, in 1889, he produces a newspaper in consolidation with a handful of others called El Sábado Secreto, the Secret Sabbath, which is circulated only among Israelites, at least the first issue claims. And the purpose of this is to draw out the history of Mexico, of the fanaticism of the Inquisition, he says, of the Jewish contribution to Mexican identity. And he appears to be doing what many liberals like himself were doing at around the same time, which is to try to find out what the essence of Mexican identity and greatness are. The most traditional answer we tend to hear in the 20th and 21st centuries is that it is this perfect, harmonious and homogeneous fusion of the indigenous and the Spaniard. And this particular version of the nationalist project becomes the flagship symbol for how we think of ourselves and what we really are. But Rivas does something quite different, because he says that in fact, not only are these two populations important, but the neglected populations of Jews and Conversos and Muslims and Moriscos, Muslims who were also forcibly converted, should contribute to our understanding of Mexican national identity. And in this spirit, he continues to engage with the Jewish community and is recognized and understood by most of them as a Jew. He attempts with some of them to start an early congregation as early as 1905.
Wow.
The Sociedad Emmanuel, the Congregation Emmanuel. And the attempt fails after its first organizational meeting at his home, because some members of the committee that have formed doubt that he is a Jew. And this is particularly problematic for that congregation to be, because he is elected president of it.
Oh boy.
So his Jewish status is called into question, and although he remains a participant in the Jewish community, active in the Jewish community for the rest of his life, and continues to claim that he is of Jewish stock, the community is somewhat murky about this, about exactly how to receive him. Nonetheless, he is a signatory in 1912 in the formation of the Alianza Monte Sinai, which the Mount Sinai Alliance,
Okay.
which is the first Jewish group founded in Mexico, and the wellspring for all of the communities that exist there now. So he has this very pivotal role and recognition as a public Jew in late 19th and early 20th century Mexico that almost no one else has, and certainly no one who's claiming Western Sephardic descent. There are settlers there who are from the Ottoman Empire and from other places, but he's the only one I'm aware of who claims Western Sephardic descent. And from then on, there are vanishingly few hints. There are a couple of names mentioned of people, including a colleague of Rivas, a Professor de Leon, we don't know his first name, who also claimed to be a member of this descendant community, and who attended services at Rosh Hashanah in the early formation of the congregation. But from then on until about the 1970s, we see almost no record of persons claiming this. Doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't, they don't exist, but they haven't been found. But beginning in about 1970, we start to see an uptick, very slowly at first, and then much faster through the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that uptick tends to coincide with public awareness of the phenomenon as a whole. In other words, it becomes a feedback loop that as more media attention and publicity come out about this community, more people start looking into their own families, and more people start claiming that, oh, well, I already knew, but I didn't want to talk about it because of the lingering anti-Semitism here. It's also sped up by something that happens at the very tail end of Vatican II, which is the promulgation of Nostra Aetate. And this proclamation in 1965 formally removes from Catholic teaching and forbids from Catholic teaching the doctrine of the deicide of Jesus Christ by Jews and the Jews' collective responsibility for all time for having murdered the Son of God. So that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism just evaporates from Mexico, of course not. But what you do see is a slow opening to an understanding from within the Catholic world of Mexico and New Mexico, the wider Southwest, of Jews as persons who should not be thought of in this negative light. And with that, you start to see a roughly contemporaneous upswing. And I should say that the same thing happens at around the same time in Brazil.
Wow.
And I suspect that the reason has to do with the fact that this is also the time of the emergence of racial and ethnic movements. So the civil rights and black empowerment movements, the Black Panthers, the Chicano movement, various Asian movements, indigenous movements, and all of these are seeking a piece of recognition for their group as they understand themselves.
That puts it in such a wide angle lens. It's a beautiful thing to see that this is just part of what was going on in culture.
Absolutely,
and
it's not just limited to the Americas, because as far back as the 1920s, you start to see the rise of a Converso descent community in Portugal, which in 1938 got its own synagogue. And that synagogue remains the largest synagogue in the Iberian Peninsula, and only the second to rise since the Inquisition. I think the first was in Lisbon in 1904. So not long before this one.
Right.
And so you can see hints and pieces of a global movement, and one increasingly connected to something else that's new, which is the State of Israel. Because the State of Israel is founded in 1948 and issues a law of return in 1950, stating that anyone who is a Jew is welcome and should be encouraged to immigrate to Israel. Only a small number of this community in the American Southwest opt to do that. In fact, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but you do see this occurring in Mallorca, which also begins to have a Converso descent community in the 1970s. You see this in Portugal, and you see this in other places. And this poses the thorny question of how to adjudicate. I'm tempted to make the pun, adjudicate. Who is and is not someone to be recognized as a Jew, and if they are not, what steps need to be taken for them to be recognized as a member of the Jewish people? This is something that affects not just Converso descent claimants, but anyone claiming to be of Jewish descent who has had this level of separation from a putatively Jewish past.
Right.
You see this in Ethiopia with a completely different population, and you also see it in India, where several thousand people, part of a group called the B'nai Menashe, also claim to be of Jewish descent. And now thousands of them are moving to Israel.
Wow.
And unfortunately being settled predominantly near Gaza, which is a serious problem in the current environment. So it really is something datable to about the 1970s and maybe the tail end of the 1960s. I know of one record from 1969 of someone who had asked a rabbi in the borderlands of California about his family's practices, and been told that they were potentially of Jewish origin. For New Mexico, the boom period is really the 1980s. And there are a few reasons for that, but the one that I'll home in on is that in the 1970s, a researcher named Stan Hortis, had begun researching claimants to Converso descent in this part of the United States and northern Mexico. And in the very early 80s, I believe from 1981 to 82, he becomes the state historian for New Mexico. And this comes with it the infrastructure to continue this project.
Right.
He begins on that basis something called the Sephardic Legacy Project, in collaboration, I should say, with Bob Martinez, who is the state historian now. And they begin collecting oral histories and other records as best they can from members of this community from the past of the American Southwest, and attempt to piece together whether and to what extent the claims of these members map to something that seems to be Jewish in origin, seems to be Converso in origin, which is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. As I said, there's virtually no material culture in New Mexico, where most of the claimants are coming from. There are vanishingly few records, and the claims tend to come overwhelmingly from then living people claiming family practices with a Jewish origin. In a few cases, we have good reason to suspect that they probably were not of Jewish origin, but in others, it's much less clear. And this leaves us with not quite a big fat I don't know, but certainly something that is more speculative than any historian or historically inclined anthropologist would like. A lady who just departed New Mexico for the East Coast last year, Nan Rubin, then produced a 1988 NPR piece, about 30 minutes long.
I read about that, yes.
The Hidden Jews of New Mexico, and the first part is called, I believe, The Search for a Buried Past, or Search for a Buried Past. And this short NPR piece that she co-produced with a man named Ben Shapiro, not to be confused with the political pundit, ignites an explosion of interest among persons who had already been around, and some of whom had already been claiming Converso descent, but become much more active, much more public, much more prone to advocacy and activism within that community.
Right.
And so the handful of others that we see in the 1980s, for example, Rabbi Stephen Leon in El Paso in 1986, sees the same thing. Within a day or two of him moving to El Paso, as a rabbi, he starts to be approached by persons of Hispano descent who also say that they are persons of Converso descent or of crypto-Jewish descent. And even getting his cable installed, someone sees a Star of David on his wall and says, "Can I talk to you, Rabbi? I have family who have these unusual practices. Can you please help me understand where they came from? Because I think that they might be of Jewish origin." There is a Russian Orthodox priest in Albuquerque, in the Barelas neighborhood, Father Semyon Carmona. And Carmona, although raised as a Catholic, discovered at a young age, according to him, that he had Jewish stock in his family as well. And in several interviews over the mid and late 1980s, he discusses this and says that members of the community who also believe that they are of Converso descent come to him to have themselves and their children blessed, quote, in the Jewish way, unquote. And there are photos of him in his clerical vestments, his habit, I should say, because he was also a monk, but also wearing a Star of David necklace. Mm-hmm. And so he, at the one and the same time, he is someone who thinks of himself as proudly of Jewish or partly of Jewish descent, but also someone who's deeply committed to Russian Orthodoxy, and so much so that he is himself a priest. That church is still there, but unfortunately the mural that was there is no longer there. He painted a mural that included himself. And so if you were ever in the Barelas neighborhood of Albuquerque, you would have seen this small church / monastery with a mural that he painted of himself at just the time when he was talking about Converso descent and this sort of thing. And the only thing I will finish on that score with is to say that there's a capstone for all of this, of course, which is called the internet. And by the end of the 20th century, the word is out. Right. Not just that this community exists. There's a New York Times piece published in 1990, and then another in 92, I believe, and the 500th anniversary of the expulsion from Spain. Right. So word is out among virtually everyone that this community exists, but also word is out that they aren't the only ones. In fact, there are communities in Brazil and Majorca and Portugal and other parts of Europe and other parts of Latin America who are all in some way involved in exploring, researching, advocating for Converso descent and themselves as Converso descendants. And we see a few small hints of this in the American Southwest with some tiny communities such as Avde Torahaya, first in Portland and then in Chandler, Arizona, and the Anusim Center and Synagogue, which is based in El Paso. Say about 30 to 40 members, perhaps as many as 50. But these demographic specific synagogues are really the exception because it costs a great deal of money to establish. Right. You need space, you need community interest, and not everyone has that. Not everyone who finds out that they have Converso stock or believes they do suddenly decides, aha, I'm Jewish and I should become a religiously normative Jew. Right. I don't know if either of you have Japanese ancestry, let's say, but if you were doing a genealogy and someone with good bona fides in genealogy says to you, well, I am shocked to tell you this, but you have a large clutch of Japanese ancestry, even a small clutch of Japanese ancestry. You might have a gee whiz moment. Right, sure. It might transform the way you think about yourself, the way you think about where you came from. It might affect the sense of identity you carry with you the rest of your life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you will then start adopting Japanese-ness, whatever constitutes Japanese-ness in your mind, as the core of your putative identity. Right. And so many persons who believe they are of Converso descent or partial descent never convert to Judaism at all. Right. They are content with Catholicism or with Protestantism, which is the main pair of backgrounds that they come from. But it's really a minority of this community who actually take the next step and consider themselves returnees, which then opens the question of whether they should or should not be required to formally convert because they believe that they are of Converso stock. So why would they then need to convert? That's a separate kettle of fish that I won't get into. But it leads to a mosaic of persons who mostly don't claim to be Jews full stop or crypto-Jews full stop. And this means that the demographic today throughout the Southwest and in Mexico is quite scattered. It follows roughly the demographic patterns of urban centers. So there might be more of them in El Paso than somewhere else, let's say.
Right.
But it doesn't follow that they then form demographic-specific synagogues, even when they are made up of persons who identify as Jewish or who are Jewish converts or reverts. Typically, they just melt into the dominant Ashkenazi synagogues in the Southwest
Right.
and practice Judaism in the normatively Ashkenazi way that they find around them, and that landscape is pretty well where we see the community today. I'm certainly no expert in genomics or in DNA, so I can't speak too much to the efficacy of DNA tests that have been done, or to private DNA tests through Ancestry or 23andMe or whatever. But it is worth noting that there are at least hints and suggestions that it could be the case. Mm-hmm. The earlier studies are far less reliable.
Right.
There's a well-known one from the early 2000s or late 90s involving disease markers in the San Luis Valley, the sort of northern extreme of colonial New Spain. And markers like that tend not to be as reliable an indicator as we would like of something like Converso descent. And in a few cases, it's clear that what people are doing is kind of aping the genealogical results we find from Ashkenazi Jews.
Gotcha.
Ashkenazi Jews have a much smaller founding population of about 350 people, and they tended to remain strongly endogamous. And this means that it's not uncommon today to find a person who is 99% or 100% Ashkenazi in a DNA test.
Right.
Whereas that is far less typical for the population we're talking about, simply because we're talking about centuries, in some cases many, many, many centuries, of assimilation within a larger Hispanic population.
So can you tell us about your archive project at NMSU? What did you accomplish there?
Absolutely. So since January of 2024, I've been the founding archivist and project manager for the Converso Legacy Archives, originally, as I said, the Crypto-Jewish Historical Archives. CLA is, to my knowledge, the first systematic attempt to gather and preserve materials specifically on claimants to Converso descent. Because of the lack of pre-modern material culture, colonial era material culture and documentation, we're talking overwhelmingly, almost entirely, about modern records. Mm-hmm. So what I am interested in as an archivist for CLA is on gathering records from modern descent claimants about their identity formation, about their community organizing, about the ways that they relate to various categories important to the region, so the Hispano label, Jewish identity, Catholic or Christian identity, and how they work through these categories. So the records consist of the entire archive of the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies, on whose board of directors I sit as archivist. It includes a number of private collections from individual donors who had been present in the community from some of its earliest outreach efforts. And this means that these are priceless records of a community formation in real time.
Oh, wow.
Simply because we're talking about them only a few decades later.
Right.
Over last summer, Stan Hortus kindly agreed to allow his entire 14 cubic feet, I believe, of field notes and research records to be included within CLA, and I'm attempting as best I can to collect and do some oral histories, because I have noticed since the beginning of the project that one significant problem is collecting records of these people while they are still with us.
Right.
Most Converso descent claimants I have ever met are baby boomers or members of the silent generation, people born between 1925 and 1945.
So time is limited.
And there is some urgency. Time is limited. In a few cases, I've had donors who are either descent claimants or connected to them. They're not descent claimants themselves, but they might be community organizers with them, who are in their 90s now. And collecting records from them as soon as possible is important, and they're often aware of it. So the archivist often has to do the impolite work of bringing that to someone's attention, but in many cases they come to me saying, all right, I need to be honest and tell you that these records need a home. It sounds like you have one.
Which is awesome that there is a place to go with this kind of information.
And until last November, there was no place as such. I spent the better part of last year building up the infrastructure and the inaugural collections in order to find a permanent home that would be acceptable. And settled within a few months on the State Record Center and Archives in Santa Fe, partially because of the historical importance of Santa Fe and its antiquity, partially because the archive of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society is there.
Right.
And so now, since November, when CLA was established, you have a one-stop shop as a researcher coming from out of state or out of city to research this community and the connections with materials that I have within CLA, but also materials that NMJHS has that I was not able to archive because they're either ephemeral or quite rare. And so this now means that as of November 19th of last year, CLA is a formally established umbrella of collections that will be sent to the State Record Center and Archives, hopefully by the end of this year when I'm due to graduate. So with my degree...
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. So with my
big
graduation, I hope that will be around the time we get all of the records there.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today and talking about this topic. It really is fascinating.
I'm very happy to have done it. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of
I really appreciate it.
Of course. We are still discovering by the day, and now we have an archive to go to.
Yes, and I will say as a way of wrapping up, because I would be a bad archivist if I didn't. If anyone out there listening or viewing
Good for you.
has papers, knows anyone who has papers, has any records that you would like to contribute, please do reach out to me at SCHIF, as in frog, ANO, at nmsu.edu, and I will be happy to discuss with you prospects for organizing, for gathering those materials, and for preserving them in a permanent home.
Beautiful.
That's my archival shtick.
Here we go.
You have to. Well, that does it for this episode of Preserving History and Democracy. We want to thank our special guest once again, Sean Schifano, for joining us. Thank you, Bern, for finding another incredible guest for us. And thank you, Jacob Slaughter behind camera, for everything that he does for us. Make sure to follow us on all our social media pages and watch our podcast on YouTube or listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts.